Hello, LinkedIn Live. How are you today? I am so excited to welcome my fellow Penguin business expert author, Tom Cheesewright. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Caterina. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm so excited. It's my first interview. I don't usually do that. I don't see myself as a reporter, but I loved your book so much.
Thank you.
I have to say, I said, let me see it again this morning to prepare for the interview. And I read it again. I woke up really early and I just couldn't put it down. Tom's book is called Future-Proof Your Business. It's part of the Penguin Business Expert series, like my book, Hult Successful Meetings. And it got commended as the book of the month by Financial Times. Kudos for this. And Tom has... it looks to me like a dream job. You're an applied futurist.
Yeah, which is, a made-up job title, but one that has been a real job for me for the last 10 years now. And it sees me really try and answer two questions for my clients. And my clients are really varied. They might be big tech companies like Facebook and Google. They might be car companies like BMW and Audi. Or they might be bits of government or charities or local authorities. And for all of them, they come to me with two questions. The first is, and you might expect this for a futurist, what does the future look like? And sometimes that's the near future. They want to know about what the big opportunities are on the near horizon or what the big threats are. And so we use a variety of tools to look at the near future and the far future. But when you've done that and you've presented this vision of the future, they come back with the second question, which is, what do we do about it? That's great. You've shown us the future. What do we do next? And that's where the applied part comes in. I'm a very practical person. I'm an engineer by training, and I like to build things. I like to find solutions. I like to find answers to problems. So once we've done that foresight piece, I tend to get involved in innovation projects, in new product development, and actually organizational change as well. How do we restructure a whole organization to be fit for the future?
Now that you mentioned you're an engineer, can you tell us a little bit where you're at? Because the people will see your background and they will be curious. Let's touch this first. What are you building, Tom?
Yeah, I'm always building about 10 different things. This is my lab at home. It's where I work on my sort of real work, and it's where I work on my projects as well. And sometimes these are client related and sometimes they're just out of my interest. And I build all sorts of things. I've got sort of robots scattered around. I've got a lot of home automation stuff and bits of sort of AI driven things. But the big project for the last couple of years has been electric cars. I was doing some work in the automotive industry and came across, as part of my research, people building their own EVs. And I thought, that sounds like fun. And actually my daughters decided they liked the sound of it as well. My nerdiness about cars had rubbed off on them. And so together in lockdown, we built our own electric car. We bought a wrecked BMW, or rather an MOT failure BMW. We stripped the motor out of it. We put an electric motor in and batteries, and we got it on the road legally as of September last year. So my daily driver, not that I drive every day, but my main car is now a home-built electric vehicle.
Wow, that is really cool. I want to invite our viewers and listeners on LinkedIn. If you have any questions, please put them in the comment and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. So, Tom, people hire you to predict the future. How do you go about doing that?
So how well you can predict the future really depends on how far out you're looking. And so I tend to work in two distinct time frames. For the near future, I use a process that I developed myself. I call it intersections. And it's been called a SWOT analysis on steroids. I don't know if that's a compliment or a criticism, but it's not unfair. And it's based on the idea that actually we can usually see the seeds of the future in things that are happening today. If we understand the pressures in our organisations, in our markets, in our industries, in our cultures, in our politics, and if we can understand the trends that are coming in, sort of the levers that are getting into those existing cracks, we can see the moments of change. We can see what's going to happen next. And so what I do, whatever client, and it really does vary from supermarkets to super yachts. If somebody comes to me and says, what's the near future? We start with that intersections process. We go and do a deep dive into all of the challenges, all the problems, all the things they're facing today. And those are really easy to get to because people love talking about problems. They like to unburden themselves and get it off their chest and tell you everything that's wrong. And then we go and look at the trends. We go and look at what's happening in other countries, what's happening in adjacent markets, what's happening in bits of this market that are small but growing, what's happening in science labs around the world, what are the big sort of cultural trends, what are the sort of the most advanced people in terms of new cultures doing. And we try and bring those things together, and we look for these sort of, we call it intersections. It's literally, where do these things smash together? Where do these existing pressures intersect with these incoming trends? And then we try and scale the results. So, for example, we've got a skills shortage in the construction industry at the moment. And the big trend is we're seeing huge amounts of automation. And there's a lot of very rapid development in automation for the construction industry at the moment. I'm just writing a paper for the construction industry, so this is fresh in my mind. So how do those two trends come together? We've got this big skills shortage, a very aging workforce. I think like over a third of workers in the construction industry are over 45 in the UK. And so we've got this big skills challenge. We've got incoming automation. Okay, let's try and understand that impact. Is it positive, negative? Does it increase the workforce? Does it displace the workforce? What's the scale? And then we try and rank those and give people things to focus on. If we're looking at the far future, then clearly it's a much bigger spread. It's a much bigger horizon. And what we do is we look at different scenarios. And I use a variety of different forms of scenario planning to try and explore different possibilities and try and illuminate those in different ways as well. Worked on a really interesting project a few years ago where we tried to explore the future of a whole very large city, actually a whole conurbation of about 3.5 million people. And what we were trying to do was inform transport planning. And so I worked with a school of architects, a team of architects, to create a visual language to describe changes in economic status and economic performance and population, so that we could show people what these different scenarios look like. And then people start to respond to, okay, well, these three different scenarios, we've got to respond to the same challenge. What does our response look like today? And that's really critical, bringing it back to action. So many of these foresight exercises take place and they're great fun. Everyone gets into a boardroom and they stick post-it notes on the wall and people scribble on big sheets of paper, and everyone goes to the pub afterwards and everyone has a great day out, and then nothing happens. And I'm really, really focused on, okay, how do we extract value from this? How do we turn those thinking exercises, which are really positive and really valuable, into action?
I love it. So going back to the intersection, because I was reading this concept in the book, and I loved it. I could apply it on my business. I had a question. It's the intersection of the internal pressures, like we don't have good talent here, or we have this challenge, with external trends. My question is, why did you choose internal pressures versus strengths?
Because most of the time, so if you think about when the phone goes for a futurist, like when people pick up the phone to me and say, what's next? They're usually coming with one of two motivations. And one of those motivations is fear. Usually they're picking up the phone because they've already missed something. Something has already happened that they hadn't foreseen, that tripped them up, caused them damage, damaged their revenues, damaged their customer relationships, something like that. And what they're looking for is a solution to that. And so I'd say probably 2/3 of the time people call out of fear, and 1/3 of the time people call out of excitement about possibility. And so naturally the conversations started on sort of slightly negative footing. And people are very, very, people spend a lot of time talking about their strengths. It's what you have marketing departments for. And they generally, I found when I speak to executives, they believe the strengths. They drink their own Kool-Aid. I don't think you have to be in an organisation or a role more than 6 months before you kind of lose objectivity. I think it takes a very, very specific sort of person, a really unique set of characteristics, not to lose some objectivity when you're in a leadership role inside an organisation, particularly when things are going well. You start to believe all the hype, you start to believe your own marketing materials, and you sort of begin to hide in your own mind. You become blinkered to and blinded to the challenges. And so actually the biggest challenge to me when I go into an organisation to consult quite often is to uncover the challenges. And what you generally find is people at this level know of some of them, and people at this level know of some of them, and there's no connection here. So a great example is I was working with a big logistics firm, and they'd invested like £6 million in software to improve the through flow of goods. And so, as far as the executives are concerned, this problem's solved. We invested the money, we bought the software, this problem's solved. You go and talk to the people in the warehouse, the software doesn't work. Like, they were never trained to use it properly. The user interface is rubbish. That their systems relied entirely on people picking up the phone. There was loads of errors going on, like literally zeros being added to order numbers by accident. So they had a warehouse full of things that they weren't going to move for the next 2 years because somebody had accidentally ordered, a factor of 10 too many. And so you have to go and understand all these pressures at different levels. And so I think the strengths are generally quite obvious. I don't think people need to shout about the strength that often because they have a marketing department who's doing it for them. But they generally don't like to, or rather they do like to talk about the pressures, but they're kind of blinded to some of the ones that are most important, particularly at an executive level.
I love it. I love it. And it reminds me, before I became a coach, I was at Google for 8 years. And the biggest challenge we had was our success. The biggest danger, the biggest risk. The company was growing so much year on year. And I remember Larry Page, the CEO, when he would have the all hands, he would criticize the bugs. And he would criticize, because I realized what he was trying to do. He understood hubris would be the downfall, if any, of Google. So his role as the CEO was actually fight the hubris and realize we have problems, there are risks. That was his whole role as a CEO. It was very incredible that you would go in, rather than the whole inspirational rah will be, and this product has this flow, and this product that was what the CEO was doing. And I think it was good because the company was so successful. The more successful the company, the happier the staff, the more work I have to do. Because if you've got happy staff in a successful company, nobody's asking difficult questions. And so, and particularly when you find you've got people who love it so much they stay there 15, 20 years, no one's asking difficult questions. And that's when you're sort of, that's the moment of pride before the fall. Hubris, as you say. Yes. I love that you mentioned software. And when I was reading your book today, there was an overlap with my book, which you wouldn't expect, because my book was, how can we have fewer meetings? I wrote the book because I was sick of useless waste of time meetings in corporate life. And I love when you were talking about the friction that can exist between functions and departments that actually makes it difficult, the communication to flow, for the business to be agile. I was like, yes. Like this was the overlap I saw. Like we were preaching the same thing from totally different angles. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about organizational structure?
Yeah.
Some really innovative ideas there to future-proof our businesses.
I mean, first of all, let me say yours is one of the books that I keep pointing people to because I don't go into any organization without people complaining about meetings. I'm like, look, there's a book to solve this. Go and get this. Yours and gender balance your workforce. Whenever I'm in a room full of all men, it's like, you need this book and you probably need this one too. Most organizations I go into I tend to work with very big companies. And, even the newer ones are, 10, 15, 20 years old now. And that is plenty of time for things to grow organically. And, people fall into patterns of structure in organizations in terms of how they build. And, people think the public and private sector are very different. Actually, you find a lot of the same patterns in both. And it tends to be very hierarchical, very sort of vertically structured. And what you find is that actually, the more you sort of build these hierarchies, the further abstracted everyone is from the customer, from the market, from the thing you're actually there to do. And so, one of the things I started looking at, and this originally came from, started from working in the public sector. I was working with a local authority, a brilliant chief executive in a bit of local government in the UK, brought me in. He was working with one of the big consultancies. They were going through massive budget cuts, as every bit of government did in the UK about 15 years ago. And he said, look, I've got these guys in and they're going to get us in under budget. They will shrink the organisation to the point where we can afford to run. He says, but what we won't do is build an organisation that's fit for the future. And he said, I know that if I sat down with a blank sheet of paper and designed an organisation that's fit for the future, it wouldn't look like what we're going to get out of this exercise. So here's a blank sheet of paper, go and design me an organisation that's fit for the future. And so I got to do this, that sponsored this very big sort of think piece about actually, if you were going to build a bit of local government that's fit for the future, how would you do it? And the first thing I realised was that everyone was, so abstracted from the customer, so abstracted from the citizen in that case, that you were getting all of these sort of overlaps and disconnections and this friction that you talk about. Friction that slowed down the movement of information through the organisation, that slowed down the taking of critical strategic decisions, friction that actually hid data. What you saw was data being polished as it moved up through committees and hierarchies to the point where it meant nothing by the time it got to the actual decision maker. It was so sanitized, if you like. And so what I did was I redesigned the organisation. I said, actually, why don't we just put the customer right at the middle? Let's put the customer right at the heart and build one layer around them, which is all our interactions with the customer. Let's build, with a single design language, a single set of, from the visual to the written to even the sort of auditory, all our design is consistent around the customer. And then we have one data layer that contains all of our interactions as far as possible so that it's seamless, it's integrated, we can do better stuff with that data. And then around that, we build these functional units. We break all our organization down into these functional units, each one of which could be a business in its own right. And so you look at organizations, they might have a world-class finance team, and that world-class finance team in an age of automation might be overstaffed. So what do? Do you cut down the size of that finance team, or do you turn it into a business asset and say, actually, we've got a load of peers who look like us, or we've got a load of suppliers who probably don't have a brilliant finance system. We've got a load of partners. Why are we not actually selling finance services from our world-class finance team to all of these organisations? And suddenly finance goes from being a cost centre to a profit centre. And the same for marketing, the same for HR, the same for all of these different business functions. And so you end up with what I call this box of Lego bricks, where actually you can look at the organisation and say, okay, we're currently in the business of selling wine and we want to sell beer. What does it look like to sell beer, direct to consumers? What we need, delivery, slightly different delivery, we need different sourcing, but fundamentally, actually, our finance team's the same, our HR team's the same, our marketing team's the same. We've got all these building blocks. Let's restructure these building blocks to build a beer business. It's just got a different web front end on it, might have a different customer base, but functionally, we've got all these building blocks. We don't need to start from scratch. And it's a model that more and more companies are adopting, and they call it lots of different things. But if you look at the most successful companies in the world, they're building their organizations in this terms of these Lego bricks that allow them to be incredibly flexible. And the prime example is Amazon, if you'll forgive the pun. Amazon's organization is built as a box of Lego bricks that Jeff Bezos can play with and dynamically reassemble to build new propositions. And more importantly, anyone else in the world can use every one of those Lego bricks to support their own business, as about, a third of the internet does to host its applications on Amazon Web Services now.
Yes. So we have one question. I'll show it in the group, which is exactly the comment I wanted to make. Being future-proof isn't more about being agile and adapting to how the future may unpredictably change rather than trying to predict, which is exactly your point, Tom. And let me share one thought and I'll let you answer this. I was reading the book and I saw you had first the part about organizational design and agility. And, I was curious to learn about the trends in the future. Initially, I was like, why? Why do we talk about agility and organizational design first? And then it dawned on me when 2020 crisis and the pandemic hit, and I lost, because I had corporate contracts, and I lost in a week 80% of my revenue. But it was the agility of my organization. I was like, okay, corporations froze their coaching budgets, but actually individuals are at home and they really need coaching. So I shifted to coaching individuals, and it allowed me, the business grew in the following year. And I saw, I couldn't predict the pandemic, but being agile as a small business was actually more important. Well, Laurent says here, it was more important being agile and actually being able to predict. So I'd love your take on this.
If you want to build what an agile organization, what I call an athletic organization, you've got to have three components. And the ability to look at the future is absolutely critical. And let's be clear, most organizations are terrible at looking at the future. I go into organizations and say, look, spend 1% of your time focused on the future. And at first they go, oh yeah, we can do that. And then they start to look at their own diaries and where they can carve out one day every 6 months to focus on the future. And they can't do it. They can't do it. They have to go back and delegate and reorganize to try and carve out one day. You know, if you look at one of my favourite stats from a piece of work from a few years ago, we did a survey of chief financial officers and financial directors in mid-sized companies around the world. And we found, and 2/3 of them told us that their annual budget and their annual strategy do not align. Or if they do align, they only align at the top level. So the only annual strategy setting exercise that most companies do, for 2/3 of them, the budget and the strategy do not align, so it's not going to happen anyway. So most companies are terrible at the future. The first thing you need to do is look at the future and build that into your structures and your processes. You've got to have some level of foresight. But that's no good if you haven't got the second thing, which is actually the ability to take decisions off the back of that. And this is where your point about friction comes in. You know, companies are so sclerotic, so slow, and so actually unwilling to take radical decisions that actually you've got to fix that process as well. You've got to get better at taking radical decisions when you've got the evidence on which to do it. But again, neither of those things are any good if you haven't done the third thing, and you have to do that first, which is to look at the organisation and say, if something happened, if the pandemic came along, if legislation disrupted our organisation, if there was a new challenger in our market who undercut us by 50%, if, you know, our proposition just went out of fashion overnight, whatever it may be, could we change fast enough to survive? And the answer again for most companies is no. And the reason it's no is because the model for successful business for so long has been about optimization. It was finding a thing that you do, latching onto it, and saying, we're just going to get better and better and better at doing this. And when I say better, what I mean is we're going to do it more, we're going to do it more profitably, and we're going to do it in more markets. And so you get these organizations, and again, you know, lots of my clients, incredibly successful brands who've got where they are by doing what they do and iterating through that loop of improvement until they are very, very, very good at what they do and absolutely terrible at even contemplating doing something else. Yeah, really, really bad at contemplating change. They've got into this rut, this very successful rut, and then they've polished it and built up the sides to the point where they can't climb out. And so, you know, the first thing you've got to do is look at your organisation and say, you know, do we have the capability to change? Do we have the capability to innovate? Do we have the capability to do new things? Should the motivation, should the stimulus come along that forces us to do so?
Should we always then have a percentage of resources working on innovation? You remember the CocaCola model, 80% should be on the core business, and then what was it, like 15% on the next, and 5% very experimental? Is that something you suggest?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's shocking how few organisations really have that. It's funny because you meet people who are in organisations that do this, and they're like, well, of course. I mean, surely everybody does that. And the answer is no, they don't. Like, not seriously. Not in a way that. Sorry, I just froze for a second there. Not in a way that's actually going to be successful. You know, I remember, a guy from a technologist in the financial sector going into one of the big banks with, you know, great fanfare. This is about 10 years ago, about how he was going to bring, you know, sort of fintech thinking and startup thinking to this bank. And, you know, he was really positive at first, and, you know, about all these innovations, all these things they were going to do and how they were going to change the business. And then, you know, he just flamed out after about 3 years, after when he realised that all he was a PR exercise, and actually the core organisation wasn't changing at all. And, you know, he just wasn't being listened to. And I've met other people since who've gone into massive organisations with a great track record in startups and innovation, and then, you know, flamed out after a couple of years because they'd realised that actually they were changing nothing. And so, you know, I looked at, you know, examples of companies that do this well, who actually have a continuous program of innovation, and they're not investing huge amounts, you know, 10, 15%, 20%, amazing. Invest 1%, like put 1% of your revenue every year into persistent innovation. And, you know, one of the models I really like came out of a housing association here in the UK. who have a model where you don't invest a huge amount. They invest 1% of revenue. They have two very small teams. And one of the teams collects ideas from across the organisation, whether that's somebody who's going around fixing light bulbs in their houses, or somebody on the cash receipts desk, whatever it may be. They collect ideas, or from tenants actually. They collect ideas, they qualify them, and they put a business case around them. And they take that business case and they give it to the second team, and the second team is an analysis team, and it looks at this business case and it says yes or no. Like, yes, we think that stands up. No, we don't. If they say yes, it goes back to the first team, and the first team prototypes it. They go back to the person who had the idea and say, will you help us prototype this idea? Whether it means buying in a bit of technology, changing a process, creating a form, doing some research, whatever it may be, they'll prototype that change in process, and they'll do it for 6 months, something like that. And they capture all the data and they feed that data to the second team. And again, the second team is like 3 people. We're not talking huge investment here. And they'll feed it to the second team. The second team go, yes, the case is made, or no, it isn't. And if the case is made, they make the change. They put it in permanently across the organisation. And they do this every day, every month, every year, with a consistent budget that's always allocated to continuous change. And they're not big changes, but they're always listening, they're always changing. And so if they do have to make major change at any point, they've probably done 20, 30, 40% of it through these small changes. If they have to make a big change, the big change for them will be much smaller than it will be for one of their peers or one of their competitors.
I love it. I hadn't heard about this model, and I love that the separation of the people creating the ideas and the people judging the ideas. And that's something I also tackled on my book. Sometimes we get so attached on the ideas, and it's a matter of politics and influencing. But if you separate the developing ideas part, that you want creativity, and you don't care about the ideas being perfect, you just want a lot of ideas. You care about the winning ideas being good, but in the creativity, you want to encourage silly ideas, like to be innovative, and separating that stage from the let's now look at the numbers and let's make a decision. I love that concept as well.
One of the things I loved about working with them, actually, when I went in, it wasn't just the executives in the room. They opened it up to the entire organisation. So you had guys whose job was to go and fix the drains, who were painting houses, people who were doing driving vans, all in the room, because they were used to being part of the decision making process. They weren't just told what to do; they were engaged with the company because they were used to being asked their opinion about what works and what doesn't.
Talking about my previous employer again, which is I know because I worked for them 8 years. Google has this 20%, everyone is allowed to do their own thing, 20%, mostly engineers. Like I was in sales, it was more 120%. But hey, it was okay. I started doing coaching 4 years in, right? I was allowed, I had my clients, I was doing my sales and strategy, and I was doing coaching as a 20%. And 50% of their products come from this 20% of the time. How cool is that? Like when you give people autonomy, which I know you talked a lot about in your book, autonomy, responsibility, and the freedom, they will come up with things that will surprise you and delight you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. I was watching. I'm a car nerd, as we've established, and there's a great series called Revelations on Haggerty on YouTube, and they were telling the story of the Lamborghini Miura the other day. And the Lamborghini was a great delegator, and he gave his people, as you say, autonomy and responsibility. And he had a bunch of young engineers in their 20s working for the business, and he wanted to be a competitor to Rolls-Royce. He wasn't interested in sports cars. He wanted to build Rolls-Royces. But you've got this bunch of young engineers who wanted to go racing. So, kind of long story short, they came up with the Lamborghini Miura. This incredible firstly, the first supercar, really, with all sorts of incredible innovations in it. And like the oldest member of the team was like 29. But he said, look, I trust you. You're great engineers. You're great designers. You're great thinkers. I'll stand back. You do what you do and I'll support you. And basically went from they created a faraway Lamborghini's most successful vehicle, that set the standard for the organisation for ever since, and really defined a whole industry. And that's what happens when you give people autonomy and responsibility inside a framework of rules and expectations. You can't just say, you can't just give them nothing and go off, just like into the wilderness with just blue sky in front of them. You've got to define some boundaries, some expectations, some objectives. But once you've done that, step back. As long as they're inside the box you've defined, let them work.
Yeah. Tom, what are the top trends we should be aware of? Like, I know you've spent all your time looking at the future. What can you share with us?
I mean, so there's the specific and there's the general. And in the general is really interesting because I spend my history is a technologist, and I still spend a lot of my time both playing with and looking at technology. Interesting on the 20% time, by the way. My electric car project started as an entirely personal project, and it's actually won me loads of business. So it's now part of the business. It was kind of my 20% time ended up being a product, which is interesting. But in terms of trends, I think there's some really interesting general trends, particularly around technology, because it's technology that drives a lot of the change we're facing. I mean, even look at COVID. Why was COVID the pandemic that it was? Because technology enabled the reduction of friction of travel and connection and interaction, and technology enabled our response to it in many ways as well, from mRNA-based vaccines to video calling. So technology is an enormously important part of all these trends, and I think people struggle to understand technological change a lot because they get down into the weeds. They're like, okay, I need to understand blockchain, and I need to understand quantum computing, and I need to understand nanotechnology. It's like, yes, you do, but really step back, not just a foot, but 10,000 feet first, and try and understand the general trends. And I talk about five things that technology does to every market, organization, culture, and I call them change, choice, power, speed, and shape. And change is about technology takes the friction out of change. It takes the friction out of innovation. And anybody who's used computer-aided design in the last anybody used it 20 years ago and now will know that that's true. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, probably when I learned computer-aided design for the first time, if you wanted to draw something and then rotate it, you'd set it to rotate and then you'd go and make a cup of tea and come back while the computer caught up. Now my 9-year-old can design furniture for a doll's house on a web interface on a tablet and 3D print it within an hour. I mean, the difference in friction in design and innovation from 25 years ago to now is just unbelievable. So it's accelerated change. Not everything. I'm in a 200-year-old house. Not everything changes faster, but certainly the friction of innovation's gone. Choice, that same reduction in friction increases the variety in front of us. Again, you only have to sit down on your sofa and try and choose what to watch on television to learn that that's true. 10,000 different shows across Netflix, Amazon, Disney, Stars, Hulu, I mean, whatever else there are, an awful number of channels. Power, technology augments people. It means that fewer people can do more with less. And again, we come back to the construction industry I was talking about earlier. You can now buy a robot bricklayer that's just been certified by the building industry authorities that allows one person to lay bricks as fast as 3 people. So one person plus a robot does the job of 3 people. So, incredible demonstration of augmentation of this power. Change, choice, power, speed. The speed of information flow and actually our hunger for accelerated information is really interesting. Again, one of my favourite stories about this is that there was a fibre optic pipeline between 2 parts of the world carrying information at the speed of light. You wouldn't think it could get any faster. But actually, because of high frequency trading and the movement of stocks and shares, they wanted to shave some time off the speed of light travelling between 2 points. So they put a new fibre optic cable in that allowed the light to travel through air rather than through glass, which is fractionally faster. Light travels fractionally faster through air than it does through glass. And it was worthwhile spending tens of millions of pounds putting a new fibre optic cable in just to shave fractions of a second off the trading of stocks in this sort of high frequency trading world. So change, choice, power, speed, and then shape. And shape is the last one, and that's really this change in the shape of organisations, this Lego brick shape that we're starting to see, this explosion of big companies into much, much smaller units and networks. And your previous employer is a great example. If you look at a company that had the revenues that Google does today 50 years ago, it probably would have employed 5 times, 10 times as many people in order to do so. And it's not that that many people aren't engaged in making Google's profits. They're just not part of Google. The people you were selling to in many ways, in some ways, are part of the extended reach of the organization. The value chain has been exploded across a much wider range of partners, much less vertical integration, and much more of this sort of Lego brick style thinking that says, I don't need to do everything as an organization. If I'm a car company, I don't need to make engines and chassis and body panels and heaters and blowers and steering wheels and lights and lamps. Actually, the supply chain's out there. If I manage that supply chain smartly, I can actually build a car with 70 people. And you look at the sorts of the Rimacs of this world, some of the new Chinese startups, some of the new US startups in the automotive space, and they're building cars with a very small number of people using a combination of, Tesla even, using a combination of robots and very, very smart control of their supply chains.
I love it. This gives so much inspiration to the people. And as Tom said, get those 5 trends, then look at your business or even your career even. What are your internal pressures? What is it that you don't like? As you know, a big part of what I do is helping people come up with their personal and career and professional vision. And I was thinking, how can I get your expertise and adapt it to people's personal vision? And looking at those 5 trends, and then where do you want to be, or what you don't like in the now that you want, the internal pressures, getting to your point and seeing where the opportunities are. And listening to you now, especially the speed is the one I was thinking this morning, because I was thinking, yeah, but people can wait 2 years for a Birkin bag. And I have a waiting, you made me worried because I have a waiting list for one-to-one coaching, and I'm fully booked. And what does this mean? And now, as I was listening to you, I realized it's not so much always speed for instant gratification of the product, it's speed of information. The client can still wait a few weeks to a few months to work with you, but they need the information now. Or is it something you can give them now while they're waiting? Could be, it helped me thinking it's speed of information, not necessarily always, you won't be always
I think
exactly.
It's the lack of response that's going to kill them. And I think your program, I think your course is really interesting, because particularly when I go and do after dinner talks where people get to ask me questions one-to-one, and then quite often do this, and I'll go and do this thing, and the first thing people say is, okay, you've scared me. Second thing people say, thank you, that was really enjoyable. And the third thing people say is, okay, what should I do next? And then what they're asking me is, what should I do for my career? What's next for me? What's next for my bit of the business? Or they're really interested in, what should my child do? And whatever age their child is at, whether they're 10 years old, whether they're 20 years old, whether they're 30 years old, they're like, look, what should I be helping my child do for next? And I think that thought process that you sort of lead people through in terms of, okay, what are my aspirations? What are my capabilities? What's my vision? Does this work? Can I test that hypothesis? I think it's really important. It's no wonder you're fully booked, to be honest.
Well, Vision Path starts the 28th of February, and this is a group program, so this will not be fully booked. It starts
there you go.
We do have one question which I want to tackle, and if anyone else would like to ask Tom any questions, now's the time to put them in. Let's see. What criteria of evaluation for business case ideas should be how many value this idea could provide, how fast we could get value from this idea?
That's a really interesting one, because I think part of the problem we've had in the recent past is a focus on rapid return of value, very sort of short-lived ideas and that focus on sort of maximum value extraction. And it comes down to the culture of the organization in many ways. I think more and more I'm seeing organizations look long-term, focus on what I call sustainable success, rather than that sort of short-term hit of revenue or particularly profit. And I've seen this in the most unlikely places. Just pre-lockdown, I was at an event in the charity sector, and there was a guy in the front row who was from a hedge fund, and he told me they were looking at sustainable success now. When somebody from a hedge fund tells you they're focused on sustainable success, the world's changing a little bit.
I love it. Yes. A lot of the point of also looking at the future is to build a sustainable business. Yeah. And go ahead.
I was just saying, we live a long time now. We're around for many years, and you might be a chief exec in your 40s, and chair in your sort of 50s, and then non-exec in your sort of 60s and 70s, and you're still a public figure at that point. What you don't want is when you are sort of a non-exec in your 60s for the unethical decisions you made in your 40s and 50s to be coming back to haunt you. And we've seen this with a number of executives here in the UK. And I'm hearing this, I'm hearing this in fairly explicit terms from leaders who say, we cannot and we will not we will not make the choices we did in the past in terms of, balancing today's success against tomorrow's risk. We are focused now on sustainable success. We want to be sure that, partly for our own sake, that we're not stripped of our knighthoods in 20 years for terrible decisions we made today, and partly because actually we want to leave a legacy. We want to leave behind, we want to bequeath this business in good shape to the next person who comes along.
I love it. And also, it's so complementary with what I do, which is the personal vision. We always start with health and family first, also because you want to be sustainable. You don't want to have a lot of professional or business success, but then be unhealthy in the future and estranged from your kids. Like it all comes together. The fact that you take the time out of your day to look at the future, both at a business level and professional and personal, will allow you to be proud and thinking of the end in mind. I want to be proud of how I made the decisions. I want to be proud of how I reached the success. I want to be proud about the journey as much as the destination.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I've been there. 11 years ago, I was working 70 plus hours a week. I was ruining my relationship with my kids. And I wasn't happy. I was not a happy person at all. It was not sustainable. And, I took what I call an assisted leap out of my own startup, assisted because I jumped with the hand of the investors firmly in my back. And I basically made my hobby, which had been futurism from the age of 3, into my career. And I've never looked back. I've been very, very lucky that it turns out actually lots of people really need futurists. I've shown, companies are terrible at looking at the future. But you're right, it has to start with that sustainability for yourself before you get into the sustainability of anything else.
Right. As we're reaching the end, Tom, what else would you like to share with our viewers, and where can they find you?
Well, I mean, I'm blessed with the unusual name of Tom Cheesewright, so I'm pretty easy to find. I think I'm the first 13 pages if you stick my name into Google before you find another one. There are other interesting Cheesewrights out there. But yeah, stick Tom Cheesewright into Google. You'll find me on Twitter. I tweet a reasonable amount. I'm a bit less extremely online than I used to be. But tomcheesewright.com is the best place for a lot of stuff. The one thing I'm really enjoying at the moment is I'm getting involved in a lot of new product development. I'm working with a lot of product development companies, particularly in the US, who are using me as a sounding board to kind of steer innovation. So they're coming to me with a broad brief and getting me to respond to it, to give them sort of, to narrow down areas, to point them at particular trends to investigate, to introduce them to interesting people and ideas. Because I'm so lucky to do such a broad range of research that I can usually find interesting nuggets of trends, research, relationships, companies that can start them on the path and maybe accelerate that innovation. So if anybody's at that point in innovation where they're just starting down that road, I love getting involved in projects like that. They're some of my favourites at the moment. Fantastic.
And the book, Future-Proof Your Business.
Yeah, which I've given away all my copies of. But there's 2 books. There's Future-Proof Your Business, which I'm a huge fan of, and I'm really pleased with the reception to it. I'm glad you enjoyed it so much as well. Thank you. But I do have another book, High Frequency Change, as well, which is about sort of why people feel like change happens faster now. And it's also available in Chinese now. That's more of a sort of if you like, if future-proof your business is the practical how-to, high frequency change is kind of the why, albeit there's some of the why in future-proof as well. But yeah, they're both out there.
Thank you, Tom. This was such a fascinating discussion. You brought so much value to the viewers. The one thing I wanted to share for the people that came because they were interested in future-proofing their vision is my program, the leaderpath.com/visionpath. It's a 2-week program. to come up with your personal, professional, and if you're a business owner, your business vision too. It's 2 week. Every day we have 2-hour workshops, 1 2-hour workshop a week, and then you have live lessons every day. I'm live in the group every day because I've developed this process starting from the inside, and I'll be inspired, I think, now with what Tom said. We'll bring the external trends in. What do you want to do? What you're good at? Where do you want to be professionally and personally? It's a lovely program. If you're at this point that you feel you need to take a step back and really think about your future, and you want a structured, fun process, and you want to meet other people that are in the same part of their journey, I'd love to have you there. We start 28th of February for 2 weeks.
Go do it, people.
Thanks, Tom. I'll love it. I will, and I think this will be a free resource. I'll upload it on my YouTube channel to this conversation. I think it was an incredible pleasure and packed with value. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Really enjoyed it, Caterina. Thank you.
All right.